I had a flu vaccine, just a routine vaccine because we had all the vaccines, and I got vaccine injured, which gave me chronic fatigue, and I was really, really sick. If you get the side effect, it doesn't really matter how rare it is, it happens to you 100%.
Yeah, you have to live with it.
And nobody thanks you for it. Nobody is coming around to look after you to say thank you for taking this vaccine to protect me. You know, you're the one who's at home spending a fortune trying to get yourself better, not able to work, not able to socialise, you know, not knowing if you're ever going to get well. You saw elderly people, you know, looking like concentration camp victims in homes, like windows, dying on their own. You saw parents not able to comfort their children who were dying. You saw spouses separated. You saw, you know, kids masked in school with, like, you know, covering their beautiful faces. All of these things, it was so obviously evil. If we don't stand our ground and say that actually our body is the hard red line, that nobody has the right to tell us what to do, and we've got to stand firm on that, because otherwise, you know, you are effectively a slave.
Yeah. I'm delighted to have with me today Dr. Elizabeth Evans. Now, you're a very young person, but you've already retired as a doctor, and I believe that you graduated from, I think you have your MA from Cambridge University, and that's in physiology and
Medical sciences.
Medical sciences, but you have your MBBS from Imperial College London.
Yep.
And also you are the CEO of the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, is that right?
That's correct, yep.
Great. So thank you very much for coming all the way to talk to me. I would first of all like to ask you, what made you want to be a doctor?
Oh, that's a good question. So we're going back quite a long way, because I'm not quite as young as you imply, but thank you for the compliment. I think I remember being about 14 years old and watching some reality TV children's show on where they followed people in A&E every day, and it was about a half-an-hour show. And I watched this absolutely religiously, and from that moment on, I decided I definitely wanted to be a doctor. I was absolutely determined. I was so interested in, I think it was the dealing with people. I love people. I was good at science. And it just seemed really fascinating to me. And I know whenever I used to go into hospitals, I always felt really excited and very at home there. So despite the fact there were no medics in my family, that was what my career path was going to be. And sure enough, I managed to qualify as a doctor aged 23. And then sort of life took a bit of a different turn, because you mentioned that I'm retired. So I was a doctor for about 6 years, but 2 years in, I had a flu vaccine, just a routine vaccine because we had all the vaccines, and I got vaccine injured, which gave me chronic fatigue, and I was really, really sick, and had 2 years off work.
I'm sorry to hear.
So that was where my whole kind of paradigm changed from being a completely conventional, high-achieving doctor. I wanted to do obstetrics and gynecology and be a consultant. And then obviously, like, my life just ground to a halt. I was bedbound for a while, and shocked to have a sort of a reaction to a medical treatment, because I didn't know that, you know, I knew drugs could cause side effects. I didn't know vaccines could cause side effects beyond a bit of a bruised arm.
You didn't learn about that at all in med school?
No.
About the possible side effects of vaccines at all?
No, and I think that was what was like started the whole paradigm shift, because very quickly, having got ME, and that was the sort of diagnosis, I knew that Western medicine couldn't help me. But I was also determined that, you know, at the age of, I think I was about 25 by then, I didn't want my life to be over, because I wanted to get back to work. I wanted to, you know, I was very sporty. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have kids. And I kind of knew that if I followed the conventional route, that was not, you know, guaranteed. They would just say, well, if you get better, you know, that's good luck. But there was nothing they could do for me. So I started to explore other avenues. Got went to change my diet, and went to a nutritional therapist and started to notice my body, improving, my symptoms improved, my energy improved. I had acupuncture, I had osteopathy, all these things I had never heard of before. And this was like, sort of a light bulb moment to me. I was like, well, I didn't know about any of these things. It wasn't that I'd looked into them at medical school and learned that it was, there was no evidence. I just had learned nothing. And I then also started looking into whether other people had ever had a vaccine side effect, and then was astonished to read a lot of published literature showing how, this was a well documented, there were many different side effects. And I reflected on the fact that really at medical school, all we'd been taught was, a list of ingredients, and we had to learn the reason for each ingredient, but there was never a question as to aluminium, is that a good idea? It was more like aluminium, that's an adjuvant, and formaldehyde, that's a preservative. But nobody ever said, could this cause like any health problems? These sound quite poisonous. And obviously we learnt the schedule, and that was pretty much all we learnt. So when I came back to being a doctor, I thought, oh my goodness, everyone's going to be so interested, to know that you can get better from chronic fatigue syndrome, like your body can heal, because that was a revelation as well to me. It was like, no one taught me in medical school that our bodies have this incredible ability to heal and repair. And my body literally, as I did all these things and improved my diet and, did very, very careful exercise, sorted my environment out, made sure I wasn't, exposed to anything toxic, did energy medicine, so with osteopathy, acupuncture, I healed. Yes. And it took time, and it was very exciting. So that was another sort of, why did we not get taught about this at medical school? I thought unless there was a drug for it, you wouldn't, you were going to just stay sick.
And you're obviously now a complementary medicine practitioner, is that right? Could you tell me a little bit about the way that what kind of work you would be doing now with your patients? What areas do you focus on?
Yeah, so I do. I went back to medicine for a couple of years, but I really felt like a square peg in a round hole, and knew I wanted to actually help people to heal, and which is far more empowering than just kind of work in this medical paradigm. So I then had my children. I've had 4 children, so I took 10 years off to be a full-time mum.
Awesome.
And then I retrained, and I trained in a therapy called NAET, N-A-E-T, Nambudrapad's allergy elimination technique. That uses kinesiology, which is muscle testing, and acupressure to reset your body, so to sort of work out what your body's imbalances or intolerances are, and then help your body to clear them through acupressure and sort of stimulating your meridians. And you do that. I do that in conjunction with nutritional treatments. So I've been a member of the BSEM for many years, a couple of decades, who are doctors who train in nutritional medicine. So I know, basic nutrients, dietary advice as well, to kind of help people to get their health back from all sorts of conditions, chronic diseases.
Oh, wow. And do you work in conjunction with mainstream medicine as well? I mean, where do you sit with that now?
So I don't practice as a doctor, which is why I wanted to register as retired, so I'm not regulated by the GMC. And I'm very clear with my patients. I don't work as a doctor. I'm not making a conventional diagnosis. Please carry on all your treatments from your own GP. But because of my medical knowledge, I'm able, I take a full history. I'm able to know when somebody needs some medical help or needs an investigation, and I'll send them to their GP. I understand all the tests they've had, and usually people come to me when their doctors really can't do much else with them. And then I can work from a different paradigm to help work out why, what are the root causes? Why did you get sick? What's driving this? What's the toxicity? Is it environmental or emotional or infective, or have you got parasites or electromagnetic stress, all of these different things, emotional trauma, and then we can just gradually work with the body to help the body to heal.
Of course, yes. When you suffered from your vaccine injury, first of all, could I just ask, how did you know for certain that that's what it was? And secondly, when you started to heal using the alternative methods, because obviously the mainstream medicine, they were not able to help you, did you share that with your colleagues who are working as doctors and other practitioners, clinicians? What was their reaction to that?
Yes, so it was very clear, because obviously I didn't expect to have any reaction. I was admittedly, I was very run down. I was working shift work in A&E. I'd had a throat infection about a month before I'd taken a load of antibiotics. So probably my body wasn't on top of its game. And then I just randomly one day, the occupational health came through the department and said, does anyone want a vaccine? And of course, you just said, oh yeah, that'd be great. Rolled up my sleeve, didn't think anything of it. Within 24 hours, the glands came up in my neck and I had a really sore throat and I started feeling really unwell. And those symptoms never left me for another sort of 3 or 4 years probably. I sort of struggled on working, just feeling a bit under the weather, but getting worse and worse. And after about 10 days, I thought, I'll take a couple of days off. And then I didn't get up again really for another couple of months. So it was really obvious. The symptoms were so quick to start and they just deteriorated over probably 2 or 3 weeks.
Yes. How's that shaped your view around the different vaccines that are out there now? Where do you sort of stand on that? I mean, I know that we'll come to your great work through this whole so-called pandemic of COVID. But what did it do to you at that time in terms of your thinking around the vaccines that were being offered? Because there was, even then, this is about in the mid-90s, I guess.
Mid-90s, yeah.
So there was still
sort
quite
of late 90s, yeah. So I mean, I think it gave me a newfound respect for medicines and making you realise that all things come with a risk. You know, obviously there were plenty of other people who got flu vaccines at the same time who didn't get ME, but I think it made me realise you don't take a medicine lightly. So you have to have there has to be a really significant benefit for you compared to the risk. And I think that sort of stayed with me from then on, because if you get the side effect, it doesn't really matter how rare it is, it happens to you 100%.
Yeah, you have to live with it.
And nobody thanks you for it. Nobody is coming around to look after you to say, thank you for taking this vaccine to protect me. You know, you're the one who's at home spending a fortune trying to get yourself better, not able to work, not able to socialise, you know, not knowing if you're ever going to get well. So I think that really sort of started that beginning of that understanding of why ethical medicine is important, why informed consent is important, why we have to know all the risks and the benefits, and why it's a very individual decision. So, if, you know, for somebody who might die from flu, there may be the risk of ending up with ME or something else is worth it. But for me, I was a healthy young person. So that was a really stupid risk to take, actually, in hindsight. But I did it without any informed consent.
But this is the problem, isn't it? Because then it makes you question that surely they should be spending more time in med school to inform the doctors of these potential risks, to weigh the risk benefit, because it's so different for each and every person, isn't it? We're very holistic individual beings, and the way I might respond to certain food or drink or medicine is going to be so different to any other person. Why do you think it is, perhaps, then? I mean, do you lay some criticism towards the teaching of medicine in the mainstream, that why are they not bringing these things up to the attention of the students?
I think probably over the last 30, 40 years, since the advent of evidence-based medicine, which kind of started just before I was training, but was getting into its stride when I was there, it was this really great idea, you know, all of our practice should be evidence-based. And so it sounded like a really noble kind of endeavour. But what's happened, it's become a business model for pharma, because you know, the evidence that's considered is generally that's been produced by the pharmaceutical companies, because no one else can really afford to do huge clinical trials. And it's led to, initially there was sort of algorithms, or sort of guidelines, these are the best drugs to take for this illness. But that's really sort of now moved into being just a protocol. So the minute a doctor has a diagnosis, they reach for a protocol, and those protocols are just drugs. And that's where the critical thinking turns off. So I think, vaccines have been sold as this sort of panacea, this public health good, and this idea that we have, that everybody needs it for everyone to be safe. But actually that's completely overridden the reality that all medicines come with risks, and that will involve then a certain number of people, which may be significant, getting potentially catastrophic side effects.
Yes.
So I think that happened with vaccines. It hasn't happened so much but it's starting to happen with drugs now, isn't it? With things like the statins and all these sort of mass medication of individuals, I think is the antithesis of ethical medicine, which should be patient-centered and individual.
Yes, it does seem like we're living in a world where it's one size fits all, and we've got to go along. Well, the people who are practicing that kind of medicine saying we've got to follow the protocols, and we're not looking at the individual patient. I look at the timings. If you want to see a GP, you can only spend a very short time with them. They don't seem to have the time, so how are they going to get to know the patient? And then it seems to be getting a bit trickier because now they're taking telephone calls as well. And it's so much more different to actually seeing a person and examining them physically, looking at them, getting to know them. I remember when I was a kid, I could just about remember that our doctor used to come to the house and he knew all the people in the neighbourhood, and yet they didn't rush to prescribe. I remember he would reluctantly try to discourage us from taking the antibiotics as well. And avoiding medicines where possible, unless really a sort of last resort. So they wouldn't give it out willy-nilly, whereas now it seems like it's just tick the box and fill the form and quickly prescribe what's on the guidelines and what's a part of the protocol. Would you say that's something you've noticed as well?
Yeah, it's something we're really concerned about. I think the whole system now is set up as a business model for Big Pharma to encourage mass medication, because the limited time slots are a massive issue. When we learnt medicine, so back in the 90s, we were always taught, spend, half an hour on a history, because we're told about 70% of your diagnosis will come from your history. Then you must examine the patient, and your examination starts when they walk across the waiting room into your office. You will pick up things, and really good doctors have an intuition. There's a sort of the art of medicine, that sixth sense, where you just know if someone's sick. Maybe it's a smell, maybe it's just the way they walk, maybe it's just something to do with their pallor. And we used to examine, every part of them, and then fingernails and their tongues, and you could make so many diagnoses from that. How can you do any of that in a 10-minute consultation? So all it's going to be is a very reductionist, so you'll focus on one thing, so you won't see the whole picture of, this person may have multiple autoimmune diseases plus some depression, but it's almost like we're not treating somebody as a whole and then looking for what the root cause is. We're just trying to quickly find a diagnosis and then just reach for the prescription pad, because there is no time to do anything else. You can't counsel them about their, ask them about what's your home life like, is there any stress going on? Have you got mold in your house? Just basic things. Do you sleep with an air freshener by your bed? Is that why you're really wheezy, because you're breathing in chemicals all the time? Or have you got a Wi-Fi router by your bed and that's why you can't sleep? there's so many environmental factors that could be cause it, that if you remove them, the person would get well, but instead they're just getting, painkillers, anti-anxiety drugs, insomnia drug, sleeping tablets.
Yes, I really worry also about psychiatric diagnosis, because again, that's another area that's the mental health side of things is, with all these things like the SSRIs and talking about serotonin levels, and then quickly giving people the psychiatric drugs, that's actually sometimes causing them the problems like antidepressants, not only leading to side effects, but then actually causing, they're called a side effect, but sometimes they seem to be more like a direct effect, I think, and then it's very hard for a person to get off of those medications. What's your take on the psychiatric side of things? Because that seems to be happening a lot as well.
Yeah, I've been listening to some psychiatrists talking about this SSRI sort of. There's a syndrome which some people seem to be getting irreversible sexual dysfunction on them, and sort of young people who've been put, have had some life event and they've been a bit, bit depressed, and instead of being encouraged to, work through it and seeing a reaction to a life event as a natural thing, they've been, categorized as depressed, put on an SSRI. Notice they suddenly have no sex drive, but then they come off it and they never get it back. And that is, what a catastrophe. And I heard a couple of patients being described who were like in their early 20s, and then who's apparently said, if I'd been told that this was a risk, I would never have touched them. So I think we're too quick to label something as a pathology, a psychiatric pathology, rather than and then just give a pill and hope that it gets better, instead of working with a person to say that emotions are a normal part of life. Life is tough. We all go through peaks and troughs.
Yes.
And there's so much we can do, with some counselling or exercise, getting outside in nature. There's so many things we can do which are, low cost or free. Eating properly, don't binge eat, get off your phone, all of these things. But our society is now very set up to be quite pathological.
Right, yes.
The screens aren't helping, the social isolation, the stress of social media, the phones, meaning you're constantly being stressed.
Yes. And it does feel also like the modern world is not helpful, and everyone wants a quick fix because they don't have necessarily the time or sometimes the patience to cope with, maybe going through an illness for a period of time, and they want everything to be better straight away. Yeah. And sometimes the body just needs some time to heal, and you do have to be patient. I had a tennis elbow, and I remember, yes, if you're very impatient and you can't do many of the things that you normally did, and 3 months pass, 4 months, and you still can't do it. But you really have to be quite patient, and if you start to investigate and learn a bit more about your body, you also realize, it's actually quite, the tendons is not an area where the blood flows very easily, so that's why it takes a little bit longer to heal. But you're not always getting these answers, and so I feel great sympathy for the public who really rushed into it and not necessarily getting the best informed consent and the best advice. I think that would work for them better.
Yeah. And I think my illness, actually looking back now, I see it as a blessing, because that taught me a whole different side of life. It actually made me realise the power of my own body, and to feel yourself heal and to do the things that make you heal is a very empowering and, life enhancing process to go through. So, despite the fact that, all my friends were in their jobs and, getting married and having families, and I was at home, actually, I didn't get depressed because it was a really empowering process to look after myself and see the results. And I think, that stood me in really good stead at tough times in the future. So I think we often are too quick to want to get rid of the bad times and not see the blessings that can come from them if we kind of, face them head on. And
yes, learn your own power, the power that we all have.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we see these superhero heroine comics, something that they're actually talking about us. We are those super people, and we just sometimes haven't realised or been given the chance. Maybe there's some very darker forces that don't want us to realise our power, because if we all did, then maybe it could be game over for these darker forces, I think.
I'm sure there's some truth in that, definitely.
Yeah. But tell me then, because so you've had all this experience then, and then we come to 2020, which was sort of the most dramatic and life-changing events of my life, and perhaps yours, and possibly so many other people, although many haven't quite fully come to terms with the dramatic and probably, I would say, very heinous crimes against humanity that I think have been perpetrated. How did you approach it? Because in the beginning, I guess it's very confusing. It's very frightening to keep seeing a tally of people dying somewhere here, they're getting closer to Europe, and then you're seeing bodies in China dropping, and it's a very frightening event, whichever way you looked at it, whether you were believing the severity of this pandemic or not. It was always a very frightening event and very confusing. How did you approach it, and what were your thoughts?
So my brother-in-law and sister-in-law live out in North Italy. And so we knew very early on they actually got locked down, I think in February, like January, February. So they were locked down for months and months. So this was a very strange thing. So we were hearing about this, and then obviously hearing the news reports. And then, there was this sort of hype building. And then I think the most shocking moment was when they closed the schools, because I had 4 kids in school. I had one about to do A-levels, one about to do GCSEs, and the others were younger. And they were just sent home on the 20th of March, I think it was, 2020. And that was like, what is going on? This is horrific. But I remember really clearly that day, because my kids were obviously really upset, but I just said to them, whatever you do, don't buy into the fear. Because I always knew, because I just thought, well, okay, maybe this is a really bad virus. So my mind was open at that point. Yeah. But because of all the things I'd learned about holistic medicine and, our bodies and how to keep them strong and how to be healthy, which is actually what you don't learn as a doctor. So I knew how to be healthy. I just stockpiled on all of the vitamins I knew I'd need. And I knew that it didn't matter if we got it, we'd be fine. So that was a massive... So at the time, I didn't really think, is this real or is it not real? I just thought, I don't need to be scared of it, and nor do my kids. And so I kept repeating this at the beginning, right? Don't buy into the fear. You've got nothing to be scared of. We've got all the vitamins we need. Your bodies are strong. This is not going to affect you anyway. And I think that really helped, because we never got scared about anything. And initially, I guess, being a medic, I knew you could have a pandemic, so that, I was open-minded, but I was watching really closely all the figures. And and then I noticed one day, I think it was about 2.5 weeks I was listening to Radio 4. That was in the days when I did still listen to the BBC, which I haven't done for about 3 years now, because they're just awful. Yes. But I heard them talk about the new normal. And then I was like, and it was like this red flag. And I was like, what are they talking about? Because if this is a pandemic, then it will pass. Viruses come through a population, and, some people will die, probably more people will get sick, and then we'll have immunity, and then we'll move on, like, every other pandemic in history. So that makes no sense. Why do we need a new normal? Because this will be over in 3 or 4 months, tops. So that's when I started being a bit suspicious. And I think it was that 3 weeks to flatten the curve, wasn't it? And when they announced that was being extended, I knew that we were in trouble. I knew there was a problem, and that they were not being honest, because I'd been watching the figures, and I knew that this wasn't, worth shutting society, schools. I was seeing what was happening with my kids and just how awful this was. And then, when they decided to extend furlough, I remember having a big discussion with my husband, just saying that we're going to bankrupt the country. Like, this is going to be catastrophic. You can't have a whole country being paid to stay at home for more than probably about 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah. So it was all. So very quickly the alarm bells went off. So although I was open-minded for 2 or 3 weeks, I was never scared, and I was always watching what was going on.
Yeah, this is really powerful, especially for your children, to see their parents like yourself guiding them. You see, this is so important. If only all the parents had that sort of view, we wouldn't be in this mess at all. So, what a role model. And you were a great role model for myself. I can't remember the name of the organisation, the World Doctors...
I think it's World Doctors Alliance.
Yes. I saw you for the first time on a small film that I think was made by Oracle Films. I can't remember the specific film.
It was called Ask the Experts.
Ask the Experts, and it had a whole range of clinicians from around the world, all speaking about why we needed to be very precautious in avoiding. I think they were really suggesting that we must be careful and avoid taking this experimental jab that was all of a sudden being pushed on us very, very hard, if I'm honest, to the point where, you know, they were saying they would offer taxi cabs and Uber taxis for young people to go and get jabbed. They were offering it at festivals that young people love, nightclubs that young people love as well, universities as a condition to enter universities, and you just never seen anything like it, you know. Well, I decided not to have my son jabbed prior to the COVID-19 sort of farce, I would call it. And no one ever said anything against me and my decision. So it was very strange that all of a sudden, before my view was respected, now it was being we were being pressured and being told that if we didn't do this, then we were somehow culpable for other people's potential death. People be shouting at you on the trains for not wearing a mask, saying you're going to kill other people. I mean, it's just never heard anything so ridiculous. I mean, we grew up always believing that when you're sick, you hold your children much more tightly. You don't isolate them, even your elderly relatives. You try to stroke them, you try to caress them, you check up on them. The last thing you do is you isolate them. So it's not something that we'd ever been brought up to follow. That's why when this whole thing happened, I found it against my teachings, against my feelings and my natural intuition. It just felt very anti-human. But thank goodness to see your video. At that time, there were very few people speaking out. So first of all, I could just really say thank you, because you were very brave to do that, putting yourself out there on the line amongst this group of very select few medical practitioners. What made you want to do that? How did you find the courage and the conviction, and to find such people to be able to coordinate this with?
So that video was put out in November 2020, which was about 2 or 3 weeks before the vaccine got its approval, and they then started the rollout in the UK. But it was interesting. I think I was a bit ahead of the game because of my experience with vaccines. I was always nervous around vaccines, and I was watching what they were saying in the press through sort of March, April, May 2020, and they were already talking about the vaccine as a solution, and that actually just made no sense. It's not common sense, because they take a long time to develop a vaccine, but also, like, you don't give a vaccine in the middle of an epidemic, because it's too late by then. A vaccine is something that's meant to prevent something that you might be exposed to in the future. So it felt like, well, whenever they get this out, it's going to be too late. You're shutting the door after the horse is bolted. But then also looking at the technology they were using, that was really frightening, because this was like a whole new form of technology. And I read up about it, and I was thinking, well, this is making your body produce foreign proteins, and then your body attacks those proteins and the cells. So I was like, that sounds like autoimmunity to me. This is not a good thing. So I think it was in about June 2020, or June or July, I said to my husband, I think I know where this is going. This is going to vaccine mandates, and this is going to vaccine passports. So that was even only 3 months after the pandemic started. But from the rhetoric and the stuff, the irrational, crazy stuff that was being pumped in the press about these vaccines and how they were being spoken about, I was like, this is only going one way. I think we're looking at vaccine mandates down the line. And then I thought, well, we have no medical freedom movement in the UK, because we've never been mandated to have vaccines for school or anything like they would have been in America. And I've been watching the High Wire. I've been watching Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his Children's Health Defence talking, about the vaccines and learning from them, and realising they've got an amazing medical freedom movement out there. So in about September, I was like, well, if no one else is going to do this, someone's got to start a medical freedom movement, because we need our ducks in a row before mandates come, and probably before the vaccines are rolled out. Because I thought by the time they try to force something or vaccine passports on us, if we haven't got ourselves organised, it's going to be game over. So I put out a little thing on Facebook just saying, are there any doctors or lawyers or scientists out there who want to start a medical freedom movement? And for 2 weeks, I was completely inundated with emails.
Oh, wow, this is reassuring, yes.
Yeah, loads of people just saying, this is absolutely, just the stuff that was going on with the testing and the masks, that was all unethical and forcing medical, interventions on people against their consent. So there was already a lot of ethical breaches going on, and the visitor restrictions and all of these awful things that were happening to the elderly. So we thought, right, we'll get a medical freedom movement started. We'll fight on all the masks and the testing and the stuff that's happening with schools. And I thought the vaccines will come later. So we launched in October 2020 with about probably 40 or 50 of us, which was great. And then they announced they were going to go for, they were hoping to roll out before Christmas. And we were like, oh no, we don't do vaccines first. We're going to be like called anti-vaxxers. We just want to get ourselves established. But then we were like, well, we don't have a choice, because that was not the thing we wanted to campaign on in, November 2020, when the whole world was pro-vaccine. Everybody was thinking that this was going to be our way out. And we had been poring over all the data, all the studies, all the technology, and just realized this was going to be an absolute catastrophe and so dangerous.
What sort of things, because it seems to me that the evidence was there earlier on. What sort of things did you spot that were very worrying to you? I mean, I know, for example, that they wanted to offer this to the vulnerable. They wanted to offer this to the elderly and the so-called people they called not healthy children. But they've never trialled this stuff on those people at all. So as far as I could see, I mean, they hadn't trialled it, for example, on someone with a learning difficulty, a child with a learning difficulty, and they wanted to jab these people first without any kind of, this is so unethical. I mean, what other things did you come up with? Because I know one other thing I'd like to touch on with you is absolute risk reduction, I think it's called,
and
versus
relative risk reduction.
And this is massively different, isn't it? Could you maybe clarify some of the things
so the first things we were looking at really closely is what was happening in the trials, and we were looking at news reports from around the world, and there was, I think it was in the AstraZeneca trial, there were a couple of cases of transverse myelitis, and that's a very severe inflammation of the spinal cord, which can lead to paralysis. And something came out with some Guillain-Barré, and there were just real red flags in relatively small studies. These were only sort of 20,000 people. So you're thinking that if you roll that out to the whole population, that's dangerous. So there were lots of little isolated reports, if you looked for them, of reports of serious problems happening in the trials. Then when you looked at the interim data, it was really clear that the relative risk reduction, remember they were saying it's 95% effective or it's 100% effective. But actually in the study of, say, 20,000 people in each group, the vaccinated, the non-vaccinated, in the unvaccinated group, maybe only 100 people of those 20,000 caught COVID. And then in the vaccinated group, only 50 caught it. So they were saying, well, that's 100% effective because you've halved your risk. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, your risk of catching it if you were unvaccinated, it was only 100 out of 20,000 or whatever. So it was about something like, I think the figures ended up as about 1%, whereas in the vaccinated group, it was 8%. So it was something like your actual absolute reduction of risk was less than 1%.
Wow, it's huge.
And so we managed to get that. So we spent the whole of November writing a 14-paged, fully referenced open letter that we wanted to get to the MHRA, to Matt Hancock, JCVI, before they okayed the rollout, with all the reasons why this was a terrible, terrible idea. Not least the lack of any long-term safety data, because everyone was saying, oh, but we're throwing loads of money at it. It's like, well, money doesn't buy you time. This thing has not been in people's bodies for more than probably 6 months, probably 4 months, really, realistically. So we don't know what their health is going to look like in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We just don't know. At that point, it was just hoping. There was no certainty. We didn't have anybody who'd had this in their body. So we talked about informed consent. We talked about how it would, people should know, for example, that the vaccine manufacturers were indemnified. So there was a really great quote from an AstraZeneca guy, which got reported in the mainstream press in the summer of 2020, where he said, we simply can't take the risk of a chronic health problem coming up in 4 years' time. So we have to be indemnified. So we said, well, why should the public take the risk that in 4 years' time it turns out there's some awful health problem? So there were just so many different things around why this was just a reckless thing to do. And also at that point, it was obvious, because we could see the data on COVID, we knew exactly who was at risk. The risk was never huge. So even in the most vulnerable category, I think it was about an 8% death rate, which means 92% of those extremely vulnerable, extremely high-risk patients survived. And in the lowest risk, it was basically zero for children. So there was no public health, emergency at that point that would justify just rolling this out, because, that time had passed. If you'd had the product, you might have done it in, March or April, but by December, there was no emergency. It was obvious.
Yes. It's unbelievable, because they always kept telling you some kind of truth. So I remember Chris Whitty always quoted as saying, this will barely affect anybody, and don't worry. You were really reassured. You'd always hear the initial ideas about masks was, they're pretty ineffective, so we don't want the public to have to wear them. And then suddenly, when it was, the summer and the so-called cases were so low, they suddenly decided to mandate it. So they always, first of all, said, Boris Johnson said, we'll take it on the chin, we'll let it just spread. And then suddenly, oh no, we're going to lock down. Same thing with the masks. Oh no, it's not a good idea. They're not very safe. Oh, actually, we're going to make you wear it. And the same thing with everything. Oh, we don't want to jab children. No, not at all. It's just going to be the 15 million.
Yeah.
But then they always said that, and then they always went further.
And they kept,
so the pattern was there, wasn't it?
Extending the lockdowns. So do you remember we were told once we've vaccinated all the vulnerable, then everybody will be released, and then of course, and we knew again as soon as they started saying this is only for the vulnerable, I said the children are going to be next. So we wrote in February 2021 a letter to the same people, the MHRA, JCVI, and the government, saying all the reasons why this absolutely must never be given to children, because the risks were not only known but also unknown, and also there was no benefit to them at all. So why would you do it? And even before the vaccine was rolled out, it was known from, if you looked at their clinical trials, it didn't prevent transmission, because it wasn't tested for that. And there was just no evidence that it did anything to affect transmission. So there was never a reason to give it to children.
And yet this is what they kept saying in the press, especially people like Fauci always saying, and Gates, these people saying that, the only way that we can open up society is until everyone is jabbed. And it was horrendous, isn't it? The stuff that was put out, and then the coercion, the blackmail. People are hugely pressured. I know so many people who didn't want to take this jab, but a month later, you'd speak to them and they had capitulated because of the pressure at work, and God knows how much, coercion and bullying. And imagine that for adults, but then think about that at school and with children. The amount of pressure that they put adverts out there saying, you children, if you hang outside on the streets, and you could be putting, the grandmother's life at risk. I mean, just doing that to children and young people who had no risk of catching this illness hardly and getting very sick with it. They put all the burden on them to make them feel like sort of granny killers, I think, so to speak. It was horrendous.
It was it was frankly evil what happened. It was just so wrong. It was so against all morals. There was never any. The whole discussion was devoid of any morals or ethics. Nobody was ever saying, okay, we can do this, but is this the right thing to do? There was no question of right and wrong. There was there seemed to be no red lines. There was never a risk-benefit analysis or a cost-benefit analysis, of the lockdowns, for example, or it was all just, we just have to do it because we can. And that's kind of where everything went horribly wrong. And I think I know my children's generation are traumatized by what they went through, because it was the adults left the room. It's, I think we'll look back in 100 years and say, what were we thinking?
And parents then ended up harming their own children because of the fear of their own death or death of another loved one, and not being able to go to work. So you'd better get the jab because I've got to go to work, and and they just put parents in such an awkward position that they ended up becoming the inadvertent abusers of their own children.
Yeah.
And the pressure was huge. I mean, I had people at where I work at my school, I had teachers who were parents saying, I can't wait for the jab rollout to come to my 5-year-old and 7-year-old. It was that bad. Or we can't let the school open again until every child is jabbed, because they made it such a chaotic and frightening environment with the testing. Kids are going back and forth.
And the masks in school, which was awful.
Awful, yeah.
Yeah, it was so cruel. And I just feel really, really sad for that generation, what they had to go through, because, you know, never in history have children been asked to sacrifice themselves for elderly people. It was everything was inverted. It was just so anti-human. It was so immoral. It was so evil.
Yes.
Horrendous.
Now, you tried to get onto the official COVID inquiry, of course, as did many other groups like the HART group and some other groups. The very admirable groups in the UK were formed, and none of them, I believe, up to now have been able to get onto the COVID inquiry, those who were challenging the state narrative. Do you know why that was, or did you get a sort of reason for that? Am I correct in this assumption?
Yeah, so we thought, because we've written over 60 fully referenced open letters to various policymakers, ministers, regulators, all sorts of people over the last 3 or 4 years. So we felt we'd really created a paper trail of accountability, which showed who was told what evidence was available at the time. Everything's fully referenced, it's all fully argued. So we felt we had a voice, you know, because obviously people who were speaking against the vaccine had no voice when it happened. So when you get to the vaccine module, you feel like we need to now say, well, hang on, you know, the MHRA were written to with this 14-page reference letter with all these warnings in November 2020, and most of the warnings have been proven to be true. So surely that should be heard by the inquiry. So we put a really good sort of submission in to say why we should be accepted. Baroness Hallett came back and said, yes, I can see you have an interest, but it's my prerogative to be able to choose who I, you know, accept and don't accept. So no. So we then sort of challenged that. She said, well, come back with some more evidence. So then we said, well, actually, we've also been massively censored. We lost our PayPal account. I lost my personal PayPal account. There was a hit piece in the BMJ that was published to try to kind of smear us and other groups. I'm on the counter disinformation unit, you know, the Cabinet Office's list. So there's all these, I said, you know, this is in the public interest, that I'm just a citizen, you know, presenting evidence-based, rational medical ethics, you know, and science. Why has this happened? So she came back, she said, right, no, still not going to let you be a core participant, but we will ask you for a witness statement. So I'll get my solicitors to get in touch with you, which they did. So at the end of, last autumn, they asked us to put in a witness statement. So I drafted with the help of some of my team, about 50-page, fully referenced with about 100 exhibits, witness statement to go into the COVID inquiry, as did a few other groups like HART and Perseus, Children's Vaccine Group, Doctors for Patients UK. And then at the end of the year, or beginning of this year, just after we'd done this really long work, they announced that they were going to postpone the module until next year, which obviously was going to be after the election. And you just think, okay, so at that point we were like, we said to them, well, can we publish this? And they said, oh, no. Then I said, well, will you publish it when the actual inquiry comes out, you know, when that module comes? Well, we have it in it. We can decide which bits of evidence to publish on our website and which not, because they've got a whole load of documents of that people have submitted. So there was no guarantee that all this work we'd done would ever see the light of day. So we were like, fine, we'll have to put our own people's vaccine inquiry together. So we've done that.
That's what you've done, yes. That's right. And you've spoken on the video there as a witness to this as well. So that's really, really helpful.
So I'd really strongly recommend everyone goes to the peoplesvaccineinquiry.co.uk, and there are about 6 or 7 witness statements and 6 or 7 short videos, and we've kept them to 20 minutes, which is sort of the highlight presentations. And each of us takes on a different area. So obviously I'm on medical ethics. You've got Claire Craig talking about effectiveness, I think. You've got the Perseus people talking about safety. You've got Ros Jones talking about the children's vaccine. So there's lots of different perspectives to see all the different issues around the vaccine rollout.
Yes. Wow, that's amazing. And you're also a member of I think it's called the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Council. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, so that's a group led by Ros Jones, the amazing paediatrician, retired paediatrician, who is a force of nature and such an inspiration. And she was determined that people had to not be giving this poison to children. And we've had many letters that we've helped her write, but she writes letters to all sorts of people all the time, the MHRA, government, trying to bring the evidence to them and say, please just don't vaccinate the children.
Yes.
And she's got a group of probably over 100 doctors now who sign her letters, which is really encouraging.
Yes, because I remember at the time what was really shocking to me is that the actual JCVI, the Joint Committee, I think, on Vaccination and Immunisation, at the time they did actually say that we don't think that there is any benefit overall for these children between ages of 12 and 15 to have these jabs, but somehow this was overridden on the grounds of the importance of children needing to come back to school. I'm sure that it was something along those lines.
It was.
Literally, I could not believe when I heard that. It's just remarkable that they overrode their own advisory committee. I mean, what's the point of having an advisory committee?
Well, exactly. And you realise this is political and this is actually quite sinister because the whole reason the kids weren't allowed back at school was policy. It wasn't, I hate the way that people say COVID caused, this cost of living crisis. It wasn't COVID, it was COVID policies. COVID policies were a decision that was a deliberate decision made by a government to, for example, exclude children from school.
Yeah.
That could have just been turned over. Children didn't have to have a vaccine to go back to school. They just needed the policy changing.
Yes, you're quite right. I was just shocked in the end. I mean, everyone, literally, not individuals, but all the institutions joined in. So obviously school, I thought the unions that for the schools would stand up for everybody, but they didn't stand up for anyone. Also, the religious institutions would perhaps separate themselves a little bit, and when we might need our faith desperately to find an answer to what's going on, to find solace, those places were closed as well. So it was almost so perfectly planned in advance and orchestrated. But I just thought that these institutions, if people are God-fearing, God-loving, they would stand up to this, and if enough of them did, I would have thought that this would have changed, even if just the churches and the mosques, synagogues, if they just stood up, I think it would have had still a significant impact, but they also went along with it,
I mean, shocking. That was probably my biggest heartache in all of this, because I'm a really devout Christian, and my faith's really important to me, and I believe in what the Bible says, which is, that Jesus has, overcome death, and we're not to fear. And, I understand that we're in a spiritual battle between good and evil, between God and Satan.
It is.
And, we're told repeatedly in the Bible, do not fear. And wherever, there's chaos and lies and deception and fear and death, that's Satan is kind of in charge there. And we surely have a job as Christians to speak hope, because ultimately we're all going to die.
Yes.
But the one thing that, certainly my faith, and I'm sure other faiths would say the same, is that we have a bigger picture, and we can offer hope in the face of death, and not just, hopelessness. Yes. And I wrote a series of very impassioned emails to my church during this time as well, around shutting, then around masks, then around not singing. And it was just like a year of little faith. You are literally failing yourself. We're meant to be in the world, but not of the world. We're not meant to be conforming to the world. That's a false idol, following the science. Well, that's a religion, isn't it? We follow, as a Christian, we follow Jesus.
It was
So
very religious.
when you're
wasn't it?
following the science is your God. You know, and the way that they open churches to make them vaccine centres,
Yes, this was
what an
horrendous.
abomination. And I think, you know, Bob Moran captured that brilliantly, didn't he, in that cartoon he drew
priest.
of the priest, like, you know, kneeling in front of this huge syringe. It was just, we were so let down, and it was just heartbreaking to just see the collapse of faith.
Yes, across
frankly.
all the board.
And it was across all the face,
yeah.
and that was what was, you were just like, where are the people who should be saying something against us, or speaking into it and saying, you know, no, we've always lived with death, but you know, we're here, we've got to keep our humanity.
Yes.
Because if you let go of ethics in an emergency, you're going to get atrocities. You're going to, because that's why ethics are there and morals are there, to keep us on the straight and narrow, really, and to stop people abusing, you know, other people. And that's what we saw. So everywhere you see the fruits of a policy, you know, you judge a tree by its fruits, is what we're taught in the Bible. Where you saw elderly people, you know, looking like concentration camp victims in homes, like windows, dying on their own. You saw parents not able to comfort their children who were dying. You saw spouses separated. You saw, you know, kids masked in school with, like, you know, covering their beautiful faces. All of these things, it was so obviously evil.
Yes, and sometimes everything you've described there's obscene. Sometimes it was absurd, because you would see, I remember at Waterloo Station, or I think it was Charing Cross Station, actually seeing a couple wearing masks and kissing each other with the masks on. Yeah. You know, oh gosh, what
devastating.
It
was
devastating,
it was devastating how people actually lost their minds.
Yeah.
And
I'll tell you off to dance. If you were dancing, you'd be told off. You'd be told off. Don't sing "Happy Birthday" to the children. You know, the children's birthday. Don't sing. I mean, we still defied it, and it's quite interesting sometimes when you did defy it. You actually realise no one could actually stop you.
No one could stop you, exactly.
So we kept doing it. I remember
the illusion of power.
Yes.
But I remember saying, you know, probably in about the summer of 2020, another of my things, I would just say, this is a war on joy.
Yeah.
Because it was that moment. Do you remember when we were coming out of lockdown and it was really nice weather, and we were down in Cornwall, and people were actually chilling out on the beach and starting to walk around, getting close to each other. And I was like, oh, maybe people are going to get over this. Yeah. And then they brought in the mask mandates.
Shocking, isn't it?
And with just like that, they literally the next day, everyone masked up in shops.
It's like they knew, isn't it? It's like they knew, oh, if we don't do something now, this is game over for us. And I remember seeing that with an individual man who started off his soup kitchen. And the soup kitchen grew so big that everyone kept coming along. And the more it grew, the more people realised they needed this coming together again. Yeah. And they realised they weren't getting sick. Yes. They were actually getting healthier. Yeah. And then they quickly arrested him and took him away.
Yes, I saw that. That was in Forest Row, I think, near
right.
us.
Oh, yes, there's a fantastic gentleman, I think Nick, his name was, Nick Smith, deserves a quick mention. But yeah, we saw all of this stuff, and I think they, like you said, there really was Operation Warp Speed, especially the jab rollout, because they didn't want any kind of delay. I remember personally, because my mum was herself arrested outside the school, and we are certain now, without any doubt, listening to some of the police that spoke afterwards and just the timing of everything, is that they wanted people out of the way. They wanted full censorship. No one could dare speak against these jabs. I remember Bob was speaking out quite a lot through his telegraph, and they didn't mind. But as soon as the jab rollout was put in place, it's like everyone was put on notice, like, no more. The police were told, now you've got to arrest anyone, you've got to really stop any kind of gathering. I remember the marches, suddenly there was a little bit of marching. It was
banned, wasn't it?
And then suddenly people were getting thrown on the floor. Within 10 seconds, I was there myself. Yeah. Within 10 seconds, we were told to disperse. You know, it was horrendous. And people were getting thrown on the floor, and we'd never seen anything like it. And it was horrendous. And then, of course, happening to your own family member. And the police said to us about my mum, so we knew that this was something very powerful. They said, if there were more people like your mum, because the police have been observing this quite a lot, they said, there's more people like your mum, this whole thing would come to an end. So they knew. And
but do you remember
compassion?
How
it was all about compassion.
And we used to march through London. I remember that. And there was the amazing march where I think there was about 300, probably 750,000 people possibly there. And I came home and said to my family, what are they saying on the news? nothing. Literally, that the whole of London was full of marchers all day,
Yes.
miles long,
Miles long.
right through the centre of London, and nothing on the news. And you just think, wow. I mean, it was full on totalitarianism,
Yeah.
wasn't it? And I just think people don't want to believe that happened in this country, but it really did.
Yeah.
And I think with totalitarianism, you cannot afford for a single truth to come out, because the truth will just destroy it.
Yes.
Because it's just built on a house of cards, like lies, isn't it?
Yes.
Everything's a lie, but one bit of truth will just pull it down, which is why we were so censored.
Yes, but can you imagine how many people were there? I mean, it was close to 1 million,
Yeah.
surely, if not
Yes.
more. So that's a significant chunk of people, really.
Yeah.
And yet they still even buried that most sensational truth.
Yeah.
I don't think they could bury it very well, but they certainly did everything possible to bury it. But I think by then they also realised that this is building huge momentum. And I think those marches were hugely significant.
Yes,
in
they were.
pushing
They were
back.
brilliant.
I think really, really powerful. It gives goosebumps just thinking about it, because we all in the beginning must have felt quite alone as you went on your day-to-day travels in the neighbourhoods, and you didn't find too many people, if any, without a mask. So to come to a place where everyone was hugging and people were really emotional of all walks of life,
Yes. And I
old
think
ages, vulnerable, everybody.
And it sent a really powerful message, I think, to the population, to see people just, it was so joyful, people just hugging, singing, walking, and it was peaceful. It was so, do you remember the time when in Trafalgar Square, the police came running in and basically took the speakers out, and everyone just sat down in silence. That was the September one. 30,000 people in the square didn't react with violence. They just sat in silence. And it was so powerful. And you just think, because ultimately you will never overcome hate with hate. It's got to be love. It's got to be from a good place with compassion and no fear, just fear. Courage. Courage, truth, love.
It's all that matters. If you just keep that at the forefront, I think nothing can touch us. I think we've shown that we were able to withstand whatever they threw at us.
Yes.
And it was very difficult. There were very dark days.
Yes.
But look, we've done it, right? And it shows that we can stand up to all of this, and we just do it like we're almost gliding, perhaps, if possible, riding the wave. Even if the water's going that way, we can just.
And I think people are just having the courage of their convictions to say no, to cope with a little bit of discomfort around, because, the whole thing about travelling, for example, how many people had a vaccine to travel? Whereas I would say to people, but think about it, in World War II, for about 6 years, Europe was a no-go zone. But the people who, always went to France, say, every year in the 30s, wouldn't have said, well, I always go to France, so I'm just going to go anyway. And, I don't care if I get bombed because I can't miss my holiday. Life goes in seasons, doesn't it? And if you have to go without for a bit, it was obviously never going to be forever. I think people never have that bigger picture, do they? They just want everything now, and it needs to be the same as it always has been. But I think we have to accept that we have different seasons in our life, and sometimes we'll have to go without. But then if we're patient and hold the line, our time will come.
Yes. I didn't see it quite like you saw it. I was thinking, oh no, it could be a very long time before we travel. But again, for me, it was still like, well, if that's the way it's going to be, I'm not going to, regardless, succumb.
And there was always a way. Like, I had a friend who was a big skier, and obviously most of the Europe was out of the question. So she went to Bulgaria, never been there skiing before, but there was no vaccine passport. She said it was amazing. So I think people just have to think outside the box and use their imagination. There's always a way to have, some joy and some fun and a holiday. It just doesn't have to be the way you always did it.
Yes, and it could be within the UK. There's some amazing places to discover here too, and some beautiful beaches. As you say, Cornwall was quite tropical place, actually, if I'm honest. A very beautiful place.
Absolutely. And I think if we don't stand our ground and say that actually our body is the hard red line, that nobody has the right to tell us what to do, and we've got to stand firm on that, because otherwise, you are effectively a slave. That's what you do to yourself. And I think a lot of people now are probably left with a deep sense of shame at having not held the line and having just given over and sort of sold themselves for, very cheaply.
Yeah, well, this is what they said about the Second World War and the collaborators, or inadvertent collaborators with the Nazi regime, is that the people it took the people to enable this to happen because they went along with it. And I think maybe that's why people are still perhaps very quiet, because of that guilt and shame, and it's not easy for them to come to terms with what they've been through. Because I mean, everyone really who has been severely abused, traumatized.
Yeah.
We're all sort of living in a bit of a madhouse, really, and there's just a few of us who have been able to see that and try to. It's like the one flew over the cuckoo's nest, where there's only you suddenly realise the Indian chief was also not quite so mad and was pretending, but it's just surviving in a lunatic sort of place, really, or they treating us as such, and we've got to snap out of it. And we're not lunatics. We can still achieve so much in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's why all finding each other. You know, one great blessing that's come from this is just the most inspirational people that I've met that I would never have met, and these communities of people who show all those attributes that most inspire you, like the courage, the truth-telling, the love, the care for humanity. I mean, that's inspiration, isn't it? And I think ultimately that gives our life meaning in a way that just kind of going along for a quiet life will never. I think you'd end up at the end of your life, or I would anyway, just feeling that what was the point?
Yes.
You know, whereas I feel life is very, very vibrant now.
Yes.
You know,
I think it is.
And you've found your inner power. I think that's really exciting.
No going back now.
No.
It will never ever be silenced, I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I was ever this strong. I think my feeling would have been if I was in a cafe and people were shouting at me to wear a mask a couple of years ago, I wouldn't necessarily wear one. I would probably find the best thing to do is to run out. But this one, I felt I had to stand there and I had to challenge that. And in the past, I would have ran off, I think. But that's where you realise how you come of age, and you realise
you've grown.
You've grown, and you're meant to be here as well.
Yeah.
I think we're here for a reason.
It's that spiritual journey, isn't it? And I think I've really truly experienced that peace that only comes from God. And then you know that it doesn't matter what life throws at you. You've got that inner strength and peace that comes actually from outside yourself. It comes from God.
Absolutely, yes.
And that's a great place to be.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I pray for all the other citizens, humanity, because I feel we're all on our own journey and we're all having our own experience, and I think a lot of people have really suffered tremendously, and it could have been me, that could have been, you know, I can't see it, of course, but you never know, isn't it? I mean, I could have been, 10 years ago, I know I was very afraid of HIV. Now I sort of look back and laugh at myself, and how could I have been so naive? But if I can be, then I sort of think, well, you know, I have great empathy for all the other people that haven't been able to see it, because I saw it so clearly at first. I was like, why can't you see this? You know, it's like you almost wanted to grab some parents and say, look, don't do this to your child, please, for God's sake. But you also realise that it's just not for everyone's eyes to be able to see for whatever reason.
But also, I think detaching from mainstream media is really important, because, you know, I did used to always listen to the Today programme every day, and, you know, listen to Question Time and all this. And actually, it was only through listening to it through that time, the first sort of half of 2020, when I could hear them lying, because I was on the science. I was hearing professors lying, and then I was like, this is outrageous. So, you know, I was shouting at the radio, and then I thought, my goodness, I don't want to listen to this anymore, because you are just selling us a story and you're fear mongering. And actually, I think we should avoid anyone who is spreading fear. That's not gonna bring us to a good, happy place.
But these are very eminent people. That's the shock, isn't it? And I think people found it very hard to dismiss someone like Chris Whitty, because he came across as this person that you could sort of trust. I think that's what a lot of people saw. That, well, we might not trust Johnson, but we trust Whitty. He looks like he's an eminent scientist of sorts. So it was really strange the way they brought all these different figures. They brought figures from the media, from the music, entertainment world, to try to trap people into believing that this was the right thing to do. All our former favourite musicians, you know, whether it's Queen, Brian May, or Michael Caine, or Lenny Henry, they rolled out all the figures, and I think that was very shocking.
But I think the minute you realise that there was coercion going on, you sort of have to go back to that, you know, something like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, or those children's fairy tales, the wolf in the woods that tells Little Red Riding Hood, I'm going to give you some flowers, and whatever, or the stranger danger, wasn't there? There was always a thing, if someone comes up and offers you sweets and tells you to get in their car, don't do it. So it's like we lost our sort of wisdom, our knowledge that there are predatory people around, and that when somebody is trying to coerce you into something, they're not a good person. This is not going to be for your benefit. If something's for your good, you will know. You won't need anyone to persuade you. So I think it's just, maybe we don't have that same sort of grounding in all those fairy tales and sort of old wives' tales and things that really help people to understand the dangers we face.
Yes. The hardest part to fathom was that, this was very, I think you hit the nail on the head there with that word, predatory nature. These were predators. But we just maybe didn't expect it to come from our learned and most esteemed institutions like the church, the mosques, synagogues, hospitals.
Yeah.
These are sacred organizations that people just can't imagine are going to harm us. The law courts, we thought that they would stand up to this. They might see reason, but it's been by and large unreasonable throughout the whole all of these institutions. I mean, I'm seeing now in 2024, I think it's very important to mention this because it's so frightening to think that this is still going on. I mean, I've been in contact with some people who, unfortunately, they've got gagging orders. They can't speak up, but they are having to go through places like the Court of Protection. They have vulnerable children with learning difficulties. Obviously the state is saying they don't have the capacity to make a decision, but they're completely overriding the mother's wishes, predominantly I'd say it's mothers, using the fathers as well against these mothers and the whole apparatus of the state to bear down on this mother and force these vulnerable people, without any evidence, by the way. There's no evidence to say that these things are of any benefit, and now the evidence is piling up. They're pretty harmful. And still in 2024, trying to force vaccinate some, vulnerable people against their parents' wishes. This is so horrific because this harks back to me reminds me, sorry to say this, but it reminds me of Nazi Germany, especially before 1939, the early years, which were really quite forgotten about until very recently. Those vulnerable people that you label them with these illnesses, and then you say they've got to have this jab.
Yes,
and
it's for your safety.
Yeah, this is frightening that this is still happening, and it makes me very worried that we still got a lot of work to do. And I know
we definitely have a lot of work to do. I think this has set a really dangerous precedent. This abandonment of medical ethics. And so it's normalised the unethical in politics, in the public discourse, that people now think it's okay to tell you to do something to protect them. And then, we've got the WHO, who we see on a global scale, who are trying to get global governance through healthcare. And they want the power to be able to call a pandemic and then tell countries what to do. It creates a business model for pharma again, to make countries buy certain amounts of vaccines. So they've got to have all this sharing of technology. All of this is a big industry. So there's a very powerful money and vested interests pushing these agendas, because medical ethics are really inconvenient, aren't they? If people can just actually decide what happens to themselves. It's far better if everyone just has to do what they're told, and life is not sacred anymore.
Yes, we're not being treated as individuals.
No,
with our own rights.
No, it's very dehumanising, and I agree. Like what happened with Tom, I think it was Tom's case, wasn't it? But thank goodness. Yeah. They were still trying to force vaccinate him, in 2024 when he's already had COVID anyway. And obviously he wasn't particularly vulnerable to it because he was fine. Yes. So the point is, there was no logic to their case. But how could they still think it was okay to push it on him? And that the mother, because he was over 18, had no say? I mean, my hat goes off to her and Stephen Jackson and the team, the legal team that managed to keep going with that case and got the win.
This is great news.
I'm just so happy for
because
them.
there are others who haven't had that fortune because these things happened early, and there's maybe other cases. If they've got all these gagging orders, then how do we even learn about this, and how can we help those people or prevent this? Because I know there's other people who've got small children now who are vulnerable, trisomy things, and they may grow up one day and they're frightened that when their children turn 18, what jabs are they going to try to bring upon them against their parents' wishes, who never wanted to jab these children. And these children, it's so easy to sort of dismiss them as having no capacity, but when you meet them on an everyday basis and spend time with them, and they're very clever. I mean, I've got one person, she calls me up in the morning. She knows exactly who I am. She's very communicative. She will talk for an hour, and they can say no, they don't want this and they don't want that, so we don't force them to have a certain food if they don't want it. So how on earth can we be in this position where the state wants to do this to
But I think the state has got used to this idea, especially when they locked everyone out of hospitals, so they could then do what they wanted. There was no oversight, there was no accountability. When relatives can visit and see the drug charts and see the patient, they hold the healthcare staff to account. But the healthcare system and the staff were being told, we're all going to protect you, we think you're amazing, we're clapping you every week, and nobody's allowed to visit. And then we had the awful protocols that were being done to older people, the do not resuscitate orders being put on, and do not resuscitate no longer means do not resuscitate, it means start and end of life pathway. And people need to be aware of that, because suddenly you're deemed do not treat, not just do not resuscitate. And I think so there's a lot of
so sinful.
So there's so many different unethical things now that have been introduced during this period into the system. And I think people just get hardened, their hearts get hardened. They must be something in them that knows that they're not practicing ethically, but then you just get used to it. And then the healthcare workers were not treated well either. They had to wear their masks, which must have been awful. They were vaccinated first, probably against their will. They were threatened with their jobs. And the thing is, once you've abused them, we all know that abused people go on to abuse. So I felt like, they had their ethics stripped from them by being treated really badly themselves. And I think it was all very, very malign.
Yes, and they were perhaps the scapegoat, almost thrown to the lions' den. And most people seem to stand up a lot more when they started to want to mandate it for the NHS staff, but these were the forgotten. The
care workers, 40,000 of them left, which was shocking. And lots more had jabs they didn't want, which is just, so sad.
So many horrors of this whole procedure, and there's probably so many more that we haven't even been able to touch on. But I'm really grateful to you for your time. I'd maybe just like to touch on the future and where do you see us going in terms of the next stages? Do we have to be quite concerned about the WHO and where they want to take us? Are we in a better position where we are now? Are more people coming forward? There's no doubt we've seen a lot more people come forward to start to speak out who may not have spoken out at the start of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in a battle. We are in a massive battle on many, many fronts. And I think that's where it's going to get quite difficult. The state are now trying to intervene in, children's healthcare, trying to, use Gillett competence to get children consenting very young for medication. You've got them going after the elderly. You've got these end-of-life protocols. You've got policies around pushing euthanasia, pushing, late-term abortions. There's a lot of anti-life things going on. Mass medication through fluoridation of water. You've got organ donation is now opt-out, not opt-in.
Wow.
So the state owns your body when you die unless you've opted out before you die. So that's worth knowing. So there's lots of attacks on medical ethics, and then this kind of WHO's which is basically vested interest, pharma, big business, trying to control the whole of the healthcare system for profit and for, to get an industry going against medical ethics. So, but I think, what we need to do, we need doctors to return to ethical medicine, individual doctors, they need to, because they've been completely deprofessionalised during all this. And we're moving towards a state where you could end up with AI being able to do their jobs. And that's kind of going to be the fight that we're in. And I hope we don't realise before it's too late. Doctors need to demand back their professional autonomy to be able to treat the individual patient in front of them, to maybe have a few guidelines to look at, but not to follow. You know, it should be their clinical acumen, their experience, their wisdom, their intuition, and, you know, being the patient's advocate.
Yes.
That's a far more exciting and fulfilling way to practice medicine. I can't imagine just following protocols and, you know, treating everyone like they're the same, because they're not. That's taken the joy of medicine away. So I think if we can get doctors back to ethical medicine, to really inspire them, and then also to get patients to demand ethical medicine from their doctors. So patients need to understand what an ethical consultation looks like, what their rights are, because they do have rights at the moment. We need to keep them.
Yes.
To informed consent, to bodily autonomy, to not being coerced. This is all enshrined in law and the NHS constitution and the GMC guidelines. We need to be reporting doctors that don't treat you ethically. But we need to be saying to our doctors, well, hang on, you tell me I've got to go on a statin. Well, what are the risks? What are the benefits? Why should I take it? Ask questions, get empowered, and get... I think we can turn this around, because there are certainly a lot more people awake now.
Absolutely. And we can lead by example, because I think if we can change ourselves, then we can be the example of the change that we wish to see. I think I still believe in that very strongly. I think we'll end there, because it's a little bit positive there.
Yes.
We have some hope. So I really want to say thank you so much for speaking. I really enjoyed talking with you, and it's just so nice to find someone with the wisdom that you have, experience, and humanity above all, and so much love in your heart. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.